Do you know Steven Spielberg? Let's get to know together the most important milestones in the life of this great director. In the world immediately distinguishes the name of Steven Spielberg. This American director, producer and screenwriter is one of the best film directors ever. And while Steven directed all kinds of films, he is famous for his creativity in directing adventure and science fiction films specifically. And these films were the ones who wrote his name among the most famous and influential film directors. So in this article we decided to introduce you to the most important milestones of the life of this great director and how he managed to become what he is today. 1. It inspired the making of the greatest show on earth. Steven Spielberg. When he was only 3 years old. When Steven was only 3 years old, he went with his father to watch the famous classic film The Greatest Show on Earth. And Steven took the film entirely. Especially the car and train collision that led to the burning of the car and the derailment of the train. As a result of this experience, Steven became very interested in films. And also became interested in trains made by Lionel as toys for children. Where his father brought him one of them to play with. And Steven later used them in some of the films he directed as a child. 2. Steven knew at the age of 12 that he wanted to direct films when he grew up. As a child, Steven was a local scout boy who was asked to show a story via still images. But Steven asked to show that story through moving images instead of still images, and his administrator allowed him to do so. So Steven used his father's 8mm video camera to shoot a 3-minute Western short film. Steven screened the film at a scouting meeting and was loved by his colleagues. So he began making other films during his childhood using his father's camera. 3. Steven Spielberg was born in 1946. Steven was born on December 18, 1946 in Cincinnati, Ohio, and both parents belonged to the Orthodox Jewish community. And his grandfather had emigrated from Ukraine to America. And although his family did not do so to escape the Holocaust but before that. But the birth of Steven in the period after the Holocaust and World War II greatly affected him. As evidenced by his directing of Schindler's List. 4. Steven Spielberg was ashamed to be Jewish. It's something I don't enjoy recognition. But when I was 7, 8, and 9 years old I was ashamed of being Orthodox Jews. God forgive me. I was ashamed of others understanding my father's Jewish practices. I wasn't really ashamed of being Jewish, but I felt uncomfortable sometimes, Steven says. Later, and eventually, Steven appreciated the faith he had inherited. 5. Steven Spielberg was taken from World War II. During his adolescence, Steven was an amateur director and was particularly taken in World War II and its adventures and heroisms, where he would go to the library to watch videos showing frontline combat and then create characters and stories that fit the battles he was watching, and then use this method to shoot films about World War II and show them to his family and friends. When Steven was an unknown director who was only 13 years old, he won an award for a 40-minute film about World War II that he filmed using his father's camera. 6. The divorce of his parents greatly affected his life. Although his mother had betrayed his father with his friend and engaged in an affair with him, Steven for most of his life blamed his father for this divorce. And some of his famous films such as E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind show how he felt about this experience, as the father is always absent and does not care about the lives of his children. So the lives of his children are shattered as a result, leading them to seek solace and consolation away from their family. 7. One of Steven Spielberg's amateur films was screened at a local cinema. As a teenager, Steven directed a 140-minute science fiction film called Firelight using his father's camera, which cost $500 to shoot that his father paid, but was able to get a refund after a local theater showed the film to locals. This film later inspired Steven when he made Close Encounters of the Third Kind, one of the most successful films in Hollywood history.
8.
Steven Spielberg was about to give up his dream of filmmaking because of Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia was so amazing that Steven felt it was impossible for him to make something so genius. But it had such an impact on him that he bought the soundtrack for the film and listened to it constantly for months. And when he later met the film's director David Lane, he felt like he was meeting a great expert. 9. Steven Spielberg's first work in Hollywood was an unpaid internship. When Steven was a student at California State University, he worked at Universal Studios on an unpaid internship, where he had the opportunity to write and direct a half-hour film called Amblin while working there. This film won several awards in the studio and attracted the attention of the vice president of Universal Studios, Sidney Sheinberg. 10. Steven Spielberg became one of the youngest directors in Hollywood history ever. After Amblin's success, Universal Studios offered Steven a 7-year contract to work there as a director, thus making Steven the youngest director in history to sign a long-term contract with a high-profile studio, so he gave up his college studies in order to devote himself to his career. In 2002, Steven returned to university to complete his studies in film and electronic arts. Of course, he had become a very famous director in the world of cinema.
11.
Actress Joan Crawford was terrified of working with Steven Spielberg. After Steven started working with Universal Studios under his new contract, he was asked to direct a show that included actress Joan Crawford. But the actress was terrified of the idea of working with a young unknown director who was only 21 years old, as she questioned the studio's decision to give him the job. But her mind changed completely after she met Steven and realized his genius. And the two later became close friends, and their friendship continued until Joan died. 12. The Sugarland Express was the first film directed by Steven Spielberg in full. The story of this film, which was released in 1974, revolves around a man and a woman who escape the police while trying to regain the guardianship of their child. And this film was starred by many famous actors at the time, such as Goldie Hawn, and was admired by critics. And even The Hollywood Reporter magazine framed the film as paving the way for a new direction for films, but the film did not succeed much in cinemas and among viewers. 13. The first huge film directed by Steven Spielberg was Jaws. After directing The Sugarland Express, the studio allowed Steven to direct a film based on the new book at the time, Jaws. And this film was very successful when it was released in 1975. And it won 3 Academy Awards for Best Editing, Best Soundtrack and Best Sound. And as a result of this film, Steven became a millionaire and became famous as a talented director. The success of this film stood out by its achievement of more than $500 million in revenue, which was a record at the time. And this film about a terrifying shark terrorizing beachgoers still attracts viewers to this day, and even attracted the attention of the whole world to sharks and made many people obsessed with these deadly creatures. 14. Jaws almost shattered Steven Spielberg's career. Steven was not able to finish filming the film in the specified period, but exceeded the period by several months. And he exceeded the budget set for the film by millions of dollars. And Steven suffered many difficulties during the filming of the film on the beach. And one of the biggest of these difficulties was the attempt to create a shark-shaped doll that remains under the water despite the strong waves and floats and protrudes from the water when needed. Steven described the experience of directing this film as the harsh challenge he faced during his career, but he succeeded in the challenge, changing the shape of Hollywood completely. 15. Close Encounters of the Third Kind confirmed its success. Artists who have great success at the beginning of their careers often find it very difficult to replicate their success. But Steven was different from these, receiving an Academy Award nomination for Best Director for his next film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the film won 2 Academy Awards. Written and directed entirely by Steven, this film is a bit inspired by his film Firelight. 16. Steven Spielberg collaborated with George Lucas to direct Indiana Jones. Director George Lucas was famous for the success of the Star Wars series he directed when he collaborated with Steven and the famous actor Harrison Ford to direct and create the Indiana Jones trilogy, which was a great success and became one of the most famous action, adventure and historical fantasy films throughout history. Steven received another Academy Award nomination for Best Director for Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, while Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade earned the biggest revenue in 1989. Beating rival Batman released the same year. 17. Childhood experiences. Steven Spielberg trilogy, which was a great success and became one of the most famous